Thank you everybody for joining us for the Fall State Network of Educators SNE training webinar. I am Amy Theory, your Director of Supports for Formative Assessment here at Smarter Balanced. And I would like to just take a brief moment to welcome our presenters and thank them for all of the efforts that they put to put this training together for you today. Chelsey Shade, our Associate Director for Supports for Formative Assessment, has led our work group of accessibility coaches and Smarter Balanced staff. So on that team, we have Ann Warren, Carrie Sorensen, Elise Shirkey, Serena O'Neill, and Vitaly Sheehan. This group of passionate educators really came to the call to meet your requests using our SNE feedback from the June and the July workshop. We heard your request for more training on differentiation and accessibility. We are really excited to be able to provide this accessibility and differentiation training for you because this is part of the requirements in our instructional resource quality criteria. And so there were a lot of requests for more training to help support you as you're developing resources. So this webinar will focus on accessibility, differentiation, and culturally relevant teaching. And it will help you start to build a foundation of understanding for future resource development. This is not meant to be completely comprehensive, but is a synthesis of some best practices to support you. We do not expect you to suddenly be an expert in accessibility and differentiation, but we do really want to ignite your interest in the need and help build your understanding. Again, this is going to be recorded, and so if you would like to rewatch it, you can rewatch. We will also have the slides available in the SNE training forum on the site, and we'll make sure to send it out also before the workshop. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Chelsey.
Thanks, Amy. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. During our time together, we will be discussing accessibility, differentiation, culturally responsive teaching, and how the accessibility coaches will support you at the workshop. Today's learning goal is for you to understand how to create instructional resources that are accessible, differentiated, and culturally responsive. You'll know you've met the learning goal when you can define accessibility, differentiation, and culturally responsive teaching, incorporate strategies for accessibility resources, differentiation, and CRT into your instructional resource, and know the roles and responsibilities of the accessibility coaches. We will begin with definitions of each topic so we all have a shared understanding. Vitaly will define accessibility in UDL, Serena will define differentiation, and I will define CRT.
Hi folks, this is Vitaly. It's wonderful to see everybody online. And it's terrific that we're able to talk about accessibility yet again. I appreciate all the accessibility coaches' hard work in the previous sessions, and so it's wonderful to see all the familiar faces. So as Chelsey pointed out, we're going to start by defining accessibility. It is a relatively new phenomenon in the field because even about 10 years ago, we were really just talking about accommodations and the fact that educators were just making group decisions based on group student characteristics depending on what disabilities or other accessibility and accommodations needs they may have had. But now with introduction of accessibility, we are able to make fair and equitable supports and decisions for our students in the classroom and on assessments. And so Smarter Balanced has been a champion, I'd like to say, in the field and has been promoting these ideas. So educators no longer have to think about just group general decisions. They're able to address each student's individualized needs related to accessibility based on their unique preferences and accessibility needs. And then when it comes to universal design, it is essentially one of the foundational approaches to accessibility. It really lies in the foundation of this approach because it enables educators to develop instructional and assessment materials with as many students in mind as possible at the beginning, really, rather than retrofitting and making kind of awkward decisions in the middle of the road or at the end of designing instructional and accessibility and assessment resources. Universal design also enables educators to incorporate precisely defined constructs that are culturally unbiased and are receptive of as many cultures as possible. Those materials are maximally accessible. They are also based on simple and intuitive instructions and procedures, and they are responsive to accommodations, which are also still an important aspect of this process. Examples also of those are things like American Sign Language and Braille. And I guess next we're going to talk about differentiation.
Hi, everyone. So differentiated instruction is the act of making content more approachable for students. It's based on formative assessment prior to teaching a new lesson, and the purpose is to move all students towards the learning goal. Adjustments based on students' needs can be planned in advance or responsive within the lesson. It could be adjustments to instructional presentation of content or how the students interact with the content itself, as well as differentiating the products of learning that the students create at the end of the lesson.
All right, and then CRT, or culturally responsive teaching. I want to start by acknowledging that there's many different frameworks and authors under CRT, and that we're using Ladson, Billings, and Hammond as a framework for our work. Ladson Billings states that culturally responsive teaching recognizes the importance of including students' cultural references in all aspects of learning. Hammond says that culturally responsive teachers can recognize students' cultural displays of learning and meaning making and respond positively and constructively with teaching moves that use cultural knowledge as a scaffold to connect what the student knows to new concepts and content in order to promote effective information processing. So what does this mean for you and the resources you're going to create at the workshop? Well, as you work, you'll need to include culturally responsive strategies that build off of students' background knowledge, honor them as independent learners, and create safe learning environments.
This next slide may be familiar to you. You may have seen a more detailed version of this Universal Design for Learning graphic before. It describes the ways in which educators can engage students from the outset by providing choices and options to them for expressing and representing what they've learned. For the purpose of this webinar, this graphic can also provide context for the three concepts you just heard about: accessibility, differentiation, and culturally responsive teaching. As we go through the webinar today, think about how you can include these strategies in your lessons. You might ask yourself how making your resources accessible, differentiating, and being culturally responsive can help students to engage and represent their learning and act to express what they know. The ultimate goal is to provide options to learners that encourage them to be purposeful, motivated, resourceful, knowledgeable, strategic, and goal-directed.
So this next slide might also be familiar to many folks, except that it is a slightly simplified version of our accessibility and accommodations framework that was used to develop accessibility instructional strategies in the previous SNE meetings, and collaboration among our student supports team, instructional design team, and instructional support team, and of course our wonderful accessibility coaches and all the SNE folks, which again, we appreciate all the input put into this. But just a quick reminder that we have 3 tiers of accessibility resources that are available in the assessment system and now are kind of trickling in the instructional system, because we want that consistency between instruction and assessment so that students do not see these accessibility resources as they sit down to take the test for the first time. So the first tier is the universal tools, and those are resources that are available as part of the system or are locally provided if they're not embedded, but they're there for students based on their needs and preferences. Some of them can be turned off if students find them distracting, and some examples of such resources include spell check or providing scratch paper. Then the second tier is designated supports, and those resources and then instructional strategies based on them are available to those students who need them based on the identifications and decisions from either one informed educator or a group, preferably a group of informed educators, with input from students' families, students' parents, guardians, and perhaps students themselves as appropriate. And those examples of designated supports include translation resources and color overlays. And then the third tier that we have is to support those students who have disabilities and who are supported by IEP and 504 teams. And those are particularly designated by those teams for those students in advance. And examples of those include American Sign Language or using a scribe, either on assessment or in instruction. And again, I think it's very important to emphasize that we want that consistency between instruction and assessment to really, that's why this effort to develop instructional strategies has been an ongoing one. And I feel like it is getting more and more traction in the field. I've been getting a lot of good questions and feedback on this. Next slide, please. So we have some examples that we thought we would provide just to really kind of ground this conversation in some concrete things. And here we have two examples of universal tools, a highlighter and digital notepad. And as you remember, a highlighter is an embedded tool that is used by students to mark text. Students are able to kind of hover over and mark important ideas. They're able to mark perhaps secondary information depending on what their needs are in the system. And also this tool helps students to refer back to certain parts of the passage or parts of the item that they are working with. And then the digital notepad is a kind of an equivalent of scratch paper, but it is an electronic pop-out box that allows students to take notes and make notations of instructional or of assessment resources. And then the next slide actually has some examples of how this can be used in the classroom. So we understand that we do have these resources in the system. We have them available on assessments. We have practice tests where students are able to go and practice some of the resources. But at the same time as we were working on developing instructional accessibility strategies, we were thinking about how educators could take these universal tools and implement them in various ways so that students are familiar with these strategies and are able to use them optimally so they really can benefit from them. So for the highlighter strategy, they can have physical highlighters of different colors perhaps, and again, mark certain bits of paragraphs or instructional materials, either in different colors or through underlining. If students have color-related disabilities, perhaps things like that, they can certainly color code different bits and pieces, and they can use related strategies, things like sticky strips just to mark certain pieces of paper-based materials. And then in conjunction, we can use digital notepad. And again, I mentioned that it is kind of an equivalent of scratch paper. So students can use scratch paper itself and practice their annotation skills and perhaps take some notes on the margins, really make some markings and highlight some of the important things, just write down some notes. They can use this tool to develop outlines of instructional materials. They can also, of course, use sticky notes, graphic organizers of different kinds, depending on again, what strategies we're teaching them in the classroom, and then create whole visual maps and through use of this digital notepad. And that way, again, they will be more comfortable with these resources on assessment. So again, that consistency, I can't emphasize enough, between instruction and assessment is very, very important. Next slide, I think, is Chelsey.
Thanks, Tali. So this is an example of the highlighting strategy incorporated into the instructional resource that I made during the July workshop. In this resource, the teacher prints off copies of this sheet and then puts them in sheet protectors for the students to write on. And then the students work on several problems using this highlighted quadratic formula card to scaffold using the quadratic formula. The different colors help students identify the values for A, B, and C and place them correctly in the formula. This slide is a variation of the previous, and this version was made because my table lead and the accessibility coach that I was working with, they had concerns that students with a blue-yellow color blindness wouldn't be able to access the information. So instead of using different highlighting colors, I used different shape outlines and fill colors.
Hello, everyone. One of my favorite designated supports is the illustration glossary. Words with illustrations are indicated by a faint dotted line and appear when the student hovers over the word with a mouse. These are provided to support student understanding of select vocabulary. Using this tool removes barriers that would prevent students from showing their mathematical skills, allowing them to clarify unknown words within the text and increase critical thinking. These are just a small sampling of the benefits to students when using illustration glossaries. Illustration glossaries facilitate the transfer of knowledge and skills from their native language to English, building academic vocabulary. Illustrations also scaffold access to vocabulary for those whose first language is not strong. So, what could this look like in the classroom? Well, using pictures and sketches and wordless books helps students become familiar with using pictures, drawings to gain meaning from the text. So, when teachers could begin with teaching simple vocabulary words such as nouns or verbs. So for example, when teaching about pyramids, you might sketch a pyramid or have pictures of pyramids so that students are better able to understand exactly what a pyramid is. When doing verbs, if you're teaching a word such as climbing, of course, having pictures of someone climbing and maybe in different ways can be very helpful. Another great strategy would be using wordless books. For example, this picture is from the wordless book, The Mysteries of Harris Burdick by Chris Van Allberg. The teacher might choose a page or two and ask students to create a story or describe what they notice. Other ideas might be to have students create their own illustration glossaries. They might find pictures and then write vocabulary words for each image, or provide students with slips of paper that one side is a picture and the other side is a vocabulary word, and then they can walk around and find others and challenge each other to identify what the word or what the picture represents. There are so many ways for teachers to use pictures or sketches to aid students in gaining meaning from what they're reading, and this is just a few.
Okay, so there are many ways to differentiate, and this graphic shows the needs of the student, their learning profile, their content readiness, and their personal interests to inform the teacher for the best methods of differentiation, which are the gears in this image. The methods can include leveling and scaffolding content, adjusting practice so students can interact with the concept in the concrete to abstract forms, having manipulatives available for those that require a visual support, and flexible grouping to facilitate peer-to-peer accountable conversation within content. And all of these come together, all these gears come together for implementation in the classroom, which are the green boxes that we see in the bottom. And these ideas include tiered assignments, learning menus, and small group instruction as just a few examples. So differentiated lessons, there should be a common concept tying all learning activities together. For example, if it's a middle school math classroom and you're graphing linear equations, some students might be plotting points correctly, while others might be working on rise over run, where a different group might be interpreting the data in context, deciding whether or not it's discrete data that requires a dash line, or if it's something that requires a continuous line. Moving all students from a deeper level of, towards a deeper level of understanding and working towards content mastery. This instructional resource is highlighted in the carousel and is a new digital library content playlist that was crafted over the summer, and it covers content across a single concept. This lesson has differentiation on the fly based on student results from activity 1. So the students work on activity 1, they fill in their answers, and the teacher is looking for key phrases in the student work. And based on those key phrases that the student is using, the teacher decides which particular next steps the student gets for activity 2, which means students will have different worksheets in that activity. But they aren't working in their same leveled groups. They're working in mixed groups, which means that students are having peer-to-peer mathematical conversations. They're learning from each other, even though they have different worksheets. And it helps kind of reduce some of the stigma that can sometimes be associated with leveled work. The teacher, meanwhile, is walking around the room asking targeted questions of the groups so that the students have a chance to have a deeper processing of the ideas and good conversation. There are additional considerations built into this lesson, and this includes manipulatives available for students that need that visual support, the math playground, as well as visualizing pattern growth with dots to support multiplicative patterns. For students that need a little bit deeper evaluation, we have the opportunity to use nonlinear tables, adding exponents into equations, and also exploring those concepts in context, giving the students a chance to see how math slopes apply to jobs in the real world. Other things to think about when you're differentiating lessons and getting ready for the workshop is there's also learning menus. And learning menus are a universally designed process that allows student choice to be an entry point to the content at different levels. And the teacher is able to formatively assess the student's learning based on the choices that the student makes. So if they're choosing the learning menu items that are a little bit more approachable, maybe that student still has some apprehension. That helps the teacher to realize these are things to work with with that particular student. Now I'm going to hand it over to Chelsey.
So now that we've talked about accessibility and differentiation, I'm going to jump back over to culturally responsive teaching. And I want to begin by saying that these frameworks are guided by Hammond's work on CRT and how the brain processes information. And I want to acknowledge that the examples I'm going to give should be modified based on the cultural context of your classrooms, or you can explain this to the educators when you write your notes from the author. Again, this is a super simplified version of Hammond's work, and I encourage you to read her book for a better understanding of this topic. So CRT acknowledges that there are 3 different types of culture, which are represented by the 3 circles in the image. Surface culture includes observable artifacts such as food, music, or clothes. Shallow culture includes unspoken rules such as how you greet new people or respect elders. And deep culture includes the mental models and unconscious assumptions that shape our worldview. This includes our morals, ethics, and spirituality. When there's a mismatch between the classroom environment and the deep culture of a student, this can cause the student's brain to go into a fight or flight response, and learning is impossible. So CRT is guided by 4 practice areas, but we're only going to talk about 2 of them, and the first one is awareness. Teachers must understand their own socio-political positions, cultural reference points, and implicit biases to understand how they may be interpreting student behaviors so that they can correct and interpret using appropriate cultural displays of learning and interaction. Teachers must also be aware of how students are affected by those things, as well as institutional racism and the myths of culture of poverty. When there are cultural mismatches, microaggressions, or explicit acts of racism, sexism, etc., students' brains can be triggered again into fight or flight mode, and it's impossible for them to learn. While you may not be able to explicitly address this practice area in your resource, it's important to be aware of Smarter Balanced Bias and Sensitivity Guidelines document, which is linked in this slide. And the guidelines were really developed to make sure that the assessments were fair, and they provide rules for reducing barriers to success. These rules, especially how not to anger or offend students and how to treat all groups of people with respect in materials, can be helpful when looking at the materials for your resource. For example, you can look at the topics to avoid or the topics to be treated with care when selecting your materials. Now, because we're creating instructional resources, these topics don't necessarily need to be avoided, but they do need to be treated with care. Teachers need to provide proper scaffolding and support when discussing these issues with their students. The second practice area that we'll talk about is information processing, which is dependent on how the brain functions. What's important for this webinar and helping us create great resources is how lessons can be designed to support learning. Notice that these stages correspond to those used in universal design. So the first stage of information processing is input, and during this stage, students need to be in a safe environment so that they can learn, and they need to have a reason to learn the information. This stage can be facilitated by having an Ignite section in your resource where you capture students' attention by using call and response, music, or provocative questions, or show them things that make them curious. The second stage is elaboration, and during this stage, the brain is organizing information into recognizable patterns. When students are able to link new information to their current knowledge, dendrites grow in their brains and link the two together. This stage can be supported in your resources by chunking information into bite-sized pieces, and you can help make connections to students' background knowledge by having them complete a graffiti wall activity or a KWL. The last stage is application. During this stage, the brain needs opportunities to apply new knowledge throughout practice. Your resource can support this stage by having a choose section where students are given unstructured think time, such as the muddiest point strategy, and cognitive routines, such as instructional conversations, think, pair, share, and visual maps to help the brain apply the new knowledge. So Anne is going to bring all three frameworks together for us.
During this webinar, we discussed three frameworks that can guide teachers in creating equitable instructional resources. The Venn diagram shows the similarities and differences between accessibility, differentiation, and CRT. The basic tenets of each merge as seen in the highlighted section in the middle. Teachers who keep these tenets in mind while planning their lessons, remember that to keep the lesson student-centered, provide accessibility, provide goal-oriented lessons, keep it adjustable and equitable. To illustrate, let's say I want to create an instructional resource to help students find inferences in literary text. In order to address all three frameworks, I might use reading passages from an online source that has glossaries for selected vocabulary and a line reader tool. I might want to design the lesson so students can interact with the text, receive feedback, and then correct their work. To increase opportunities of drawing from students' background knowledge, passages are categorized by demographics. For instance, like world cultures, holidays, history, and genre, to name a few. Most importantly, though, educators must consider how students' differences affect learning. We need to address differences by employing accessibility, differentiation, and culturally responsive strategies. When we provide multiple means of engagement, representation, and application, students' learning is no longer by chance. Learning becomes purposeful. When we provide intentional, well-constructed lesson plans that consider access and equity, students are better equipped to meet the intended learning goal and success criteria. And now Amy's going to wrap things up.
Awesome. Thank you so much, team. This has really been fabulous and just such valuable information for us to make sure that we're thinking about it as we're creating our resources and moving forward to support students and teachers. I wanted to just spend a little bit of time here to talk about the role of our accessibility and differentiation coaches, and that they're there to support you with both accessibility strategies, the ones that we've created and that will be in tools for teachers that teachers can directly link to. So like the strategies we've shown in this presentation, like a highlighting tool and illustration glossaries are accessibility strategies on the assessment. We have new strategies that will launch with tools for teachers that are accessibility instructional strategies that you can embed into your lessons and your resources. So your coaches are there to sit side by side with you, to make recommendations in your resources in the Google Drive, to help build your understanding, to help you locate the accessibility strategies, to help you select the strategies and embed them in your resources. And they're also there to help you with differentiation tips and culturally responsive teaching, things to consider in your resources. It's because we want to make sure that all of our resources are differentiated to support the range of students that are in our classroom. We have included in our slides a reference slide, as Chelsey mentioned, several of the sources for this information. We want to give you the opportunity if you want to take a little deeper dive. So if you're interested in learning more about universal design, we would recommend going to the CAST website. If you are looking for more information about culturally responsive teaching, please check out Hammond and Ladson-Billings. And for differentiation, Tomlinson and Vygotsky. This slide deck, again, will be archived in our SNE forum. in the digital library, and it will be sent to you prior to the beginning of the workshop. So we'll take a few days, clean up the editing, and then we will send it to you with the slides prior to the workshop. So I just really want to thank everybody for joining today. We had at the high, we had 52 participants, and I think that's 53 because I know at least 2 of you are on the same call. So that's over a third of our SNE participants for November. So I'd like to invite you at this time, if you would like to put a question in the chat box, or if you would like to come off mute. I do see one question in the chat box. Yes, there is a draft agenda that was on the registration site. We are working to finalize that, and we will get that out shortly. Any other questions about this webinar? I hope you're excited to think about your resources in a new way to ignite differentiation and accessibility and culturally responsive teaching in your classroom. Thank you, everybody. Have a fabulous day.